All right, and we're live.
Is that it?
Yeah, so if you
Is there
just want to
anybody
make,
else on from our group?
Brian Reimers is in there. Do you want me to promote him up to a panelist?
Yeah, he can come up.
Okay.
Yeah, if anybody else from the board joins, yeah, please bring them in.
All right. Joe, are you able to stay on top of that then? Because I'll be sharing my screen in a second.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Okay.
They all should have the panelist link, but I'll keep a lookout.
You want to kick it off, Keith?
Yeah, I do. So everybody, thanks for joining us today. And as we spoke about it at our last board meeting, what we talked about in the finance committee was really to have a special meeting specifically on the budget. And there was hopefully you guys took a look at the document that came out late last night. There's been a lot of work, and I can't thank Lynn and Zach enough for all the work they put into this. But really, the context of this meeting was to frame up exactly where we're at with our spending, our budget forecast, and look towards the future, because decisions we make today will affect us in the future. And there's a lot of people tossing a lot of ideas around that are great ideas, but they come with a price tag, and each of those price tags adds up if you keep spending and spending and spending. And so my goal our goal from the finance committee was to really lay out the lay of the land as it sits today. We can look at some historical stuff to give us some forecast for the future. But really, it's from today moving forward and what the spend and the ask is going to be from the entire board. So as we approach May, where we're going to approve the preliminary, well, I guess I don't even know if we already kind of approved the preliminary budget, but we're coming into June where we'll approve the final budget for next year. This will give us a good opportunity to see everything that we looked at and we're asking for. What I really don't want, what I hope we don't do it in this meeting is derail it with intense conversations, specifically surrounding things that we want to do, but we may not be able to afford to do. So we have some placeholders in there for things like sports, the baseball fields, or things like renovating QE, or things like all-day kindergarten, just to show you what it could look like conceptually moving forward. And this will be stuff that we have to talk about probably at more depth at different, maybe at different committee levels or at different board meetings. But we'll see some of that. So let's try not to get down too many tangents if we can, but more just a good understanding. And please ask away. I don't want anybody to feel like they can't ask a question. That's what this is for all of us as board members, to have a good understanding of the budget, of the spend, and what the future can look like as we go into our final budget meeting. So, Zach, did I miss anything?
Nope. If you're good, then I'm going to share my screen and we'll get on it.
Let's do it. Thank you.
Second. All right, just give me a thumbs up if everybody can see the presentation. Good. Okay. So as Keith said, tonight we're going to go through what we're calling sort of Budget 101. We do have an agenda for tonight.
Zach, can you put it into to the actual mode?
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
Last time it cut off, so just let me know if anything gets cut off.
It looks pretty good right now. Thank you.
So we're going to start off with a little bit of where we're at with our budget timeline this year, how we're doing with our budget right now, both in the 2021 and 2022. Not going to spend a lot of time on that. As Keith stated, the focus tonight is on the future. So we'll get into some cost drivers, and really what we're going to focus on is going back to the 18-19 school year, which was our last, quote unquote, regular school year before, we had some anomalies because of the pandemic, and talking a little bit about what those drivers are. And then we'll also look at one-year drivers from this year to next year. And then the focus will be, as Keith stated, we've heard a lot of things, both from individual board members, from the whole board, from administration, whatever it might be. We're going to highlight some of those things. And again, not saying we shouldn't do them, but we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in the future. And before I hand it over to Lynn to get into some of these detailed sheets here, we do have, we're going to try to stay at a high level, relatively speaking, but we have links scattered throughout this presentation where if at any point in time we feel we need to see a little bit more detail, we have that available. And at the end, we have a page that has links to all kinds of detailed sheets, and it's on our website as well. So again, we'll try to stay as high level as we can, which can be tough when you're talking about a $120 million budget, but we'll do our best. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Lynn to walk us through, a little bit of a reminder of where we're at right now with our current budget.
Hey, Zach, if we have any questions, do you want us to wait till the end then?
I think
It's
I
up
would
to you or
prefer
Keith.
the questions come on the slide, but it's up to Keith,
Okay.
because if we wait to the end, I'll have to go back to the slide that references it. It might be easier to have the question on the slide itself, if that makes sense. But Keith, it's up to you.
Yeah, I think it's that Chris, good point. If we could let the explanation kind of be, if you can just give a pause at the end of it, Zach, so that we don't want to interrupt the train of thought as you guys are speaking.
Yep.
And you can explain everything to us. And then if we have any questions, I think it'd be a great time to ask if that's okay with you guys.
I think that makes the most sense. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, Lynn.
Okay, so this slide you're looking at right now is a graphic of our 2021 fiscal year. The blue columns on the graph represent our fund balance, both the 2021 budget and what we're projecting off to the right. The red is our operational loss so far as we project it currently. So we started the year with an operating loss projected to be $7.3 million in our budget. So remember, when we did our budget for the 2021 school year, it was during the pandemic, excuse me. And so we were very conservative, even more conservative than we usually are when we were projecting our revenues and our expenditures, not really knowing what the year was going to look like. So like I said, we started with that $7.3 million deficit. Currently, we have whittled that down to a deficit of $3.4 million. The reason why it has reduced, that gap has reduced by $3.8 million is both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. So our revenues actually are coming in better than what we projected when we put the budget together. I don't know if anyone remembers the heat map graphic that we put together when we were doing the budget. So revenues are actually coming in better than our worst case scenario. Most of them are coming in between like a moderate to a best case scenario. And in some cases, even higher than that. An example of that would be our local property taxes. We projected them to come in much lower than what they have. Our collection rate this year is actually 96.8%, which is higher than our historical average. So that has really closed the gap on our revenue side. On the expenditure side, our salaries and benefits are coming in projected to be under budget. So that is how we're closing that the gap between revenues and expenditures. So any question? Oh,
I do want to add one thing,
yeah.
the sale of the school. So when we think about the operational piece, I like to think of it as a $1.4 million deficit because we always knew we would use the $2 million from the sale of the school.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we have
I was going to add, that's also in the budget number. So you really have to take that $2 million out because we knew we had to spend that money in this fiscal year. So like Zach said, our operational deficit is really now 1.4 million if you take out that $2 million.
Have any of the ESSER funds for, acceptable expenditures been accounted for in this now?
So ESSER 2 and 3, we have not allocated in the current year at all. So ESSER 2, about, Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, about 600 and some thousand has been allocated for next year.
Next, yes.
But in this year's budget, any grant money is already accounted for, but it wouldn't be ESSER 2 or 3.
No, but we do have some COVID-related grants reflected in our 2021 projections.
Yeah.
So it's both on the revenue and the expenditure side.
One of the things, Chris, I think I know where you're going about using ESSER 2 or 3 money for building and renovations and things. The counsel to us has been not to commit anything yet because the state may change what they want to withhold. Plus the rules, they have not stated what the rules are on how to use that money. But I think I know where you're going about using.
That was where I was going to go later with it, but I just wanted to see that if we had already used some of those funds for this year or if they were all being held for next year. That's.
No, we've been told that it's a 3-year account, 3-year expenditure account, but don't just plan on spending anything. We have a plan. Our expectation is to brief that plan, our recommendations to you all next week, but not to think about using that for renovation money yet.
And I mean, at current, we're looking at possibly 5.2 million on that.
Correct, between 5 and 5.2 million. The ESSER 3, which is the bulk of that, the state has not opened up the grant application, so we don't have details on ESSER 3 yet.
Okay.
So any other questions on that first slide before we move into this next one?
Okay, so this next slide kind of builds on the previous slide. The first line of the slide gives you your projected fund balance as of the end of this fiscal year. That would be that $23.4 million. Now that number may change because every month I update my projections on both revenues and expenditures. So that number may change, but that's kind of like a starting point for your 21-22 budget. So there are 3 columns on there, 3 different scenarios, which we've been kicking around in finance. The first column would be a full Act 1 index increase of 3.5%. So the local revenues are highlighted in green because they're going to change based on the tax increase. So the first column, like I said, is full Act 1 at 3.5. The second scenario, the middle column, would be half index, which would be 1.75. And the last column would be a 0% tax increase, holding the millage rate constant from 2021 into 21-22. And as you can see, obviously the operating balance will be different for each scenario. At full Act 1, currently we're projecting just under $2 million as an operating loss at full Act 1 index. Now remember, $1 million of that is the capital expenditures, which we put in the budget every year. So if you exclude that, the net operating balance is actually slightly under $1 million at full Act 1. So that's just starting with our projected fund balance in June of 21 through what it would be like June of 2022 under those 3 different scenarios.
And this wouldn't be counting any of those, that NITIG bond money, correct?
No, so
That's correct.
Straight
we
out.
like to think of the capital expenses as part of the operating budget. We break it out for visual purposes because we've talked a lot about using those NITIG funds. So if you use them, you can see how that would change the net operating balance. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on, about the impact of using that to offset, reoccurring costs. Just something we'll touch on a little later.
Have they set the Act 1 index at 3.5, or is this still just an estimate? When do they do that?
It is set at 3.5. That's actually an adjusted Act 1 index for our district.
Right.
We get an adjustment because of various factors. So no, that is set. It will not change.
That was set back in December.
I wasn't sure when it got set. Thank you.
Yeah. Do we have any questions on this slide? Okay. So that's a little bit about where we are in the current year. This is just a reminder of what our timeline is for the rest of this school year. On May 13th, which is our next, I would say, big meeting date, the board would be voting on a proposed final budget. Lynn and I will work with our department, and we have to do some advertising to make sure the community is aware and to include what that proposed final budget will look like. And then on June 10th, the board would be voting on that final budget. I did put a note in here, you know, and we'll talk about this more looking at our budget in a single year versus a 5-year perspective. But the recommendation from the administration would still be to vote on a proposed final budget at 3.5%, knowing you can always come down on June 10th. We just feel like if you did the opposite, so if you tried to do less and then found out there were things requiring, I don't know, you make a decision on QE, for example, and you would require going to full Act 1, it would feel a little bit like a bait and switch to the community if we just changed the order of operations there. So our recommendation, again, knowing you can always reduce it on June 10th, would be to hold to that 3.5% on May 13th. But obviously that's up to the board on how you want to vote on that in a couple of weeks here. Any questions? All right, Lynn, you want to just review this one? This is something we used to talk about. We got away from it the last couple of years, but we just want to remind everybody, you know, how the budget's sort of divvied up here with controllable versus non-controllable expenses.
Sure. I believe this is the graphic that John Kern always liked to see, the pie chart. So it's very basic. It shows our total budget, our 21-22 budget at 118 million approximately. I broke it down into these categories: contractual costs, mandated costs, fixed costs, and discretionary costs, meaning costs that are really somewhat within our control. Now, the only caveat to that is included in that discretionary cost is our student transportation. And while it's not mandated by the state, I don't think that we would eliminate it. I mean, we could. That is why it's included in discretionary. And that's about $5 million worth of the discretionary expenditures. So
something to consider too, just, I don't mean to, you know, be John here, I guess John's not here, but discretionary costs is not the only place where we have the ability to adjust. It's the only place we have the ability to adjust instantly.
Ron,
you talk about
John and Caitlin are in the meeting now.
Yeah, I did see John piped in. So discretionary costs is the only place we have the ability to adjust instantly. The truth is, fixed costs and mandated costs are stuck on us without our control. Contractual costs we have the ability to adjust as the contracts come up. So for the board members online, do be aware of that. So discretionary costs are not the only flexible sources of you know, expenditure and or savings.
Correct. While you're in the middle of a contract, obviously, you know, we're not able to adjust that. And I might as well go to the next slide here. So we talk a little bit about that contractual costs, which are primarily comprised of our staff salaries and benefits, or the largest bulk of our budget. You can't alter, once you have a contract, individual salaries and benefits, but you can alter the overall line item by, you know, either reducing or adding staff. There are a lot of rules and regulations and laws around if you were going to try to reduce staff in the middle of a year, or at any time for that matter. So, you know, when you're in the middle of a contract, we typically say they're contractual. You can't alter them until a contract comes up again. And then as Lynn pointed out, when we like to look at the slice of the pie that we have control over, you know, if you remove the 5 million or so for transportation and looked at it at that point, you're looking at, you know, maybe 5 or 6% of your budget. Also included in that is all of our student athletics and activities, which you don't technically have to do either, but it's another one of those things. It's unlikely that a school district would ever remove them. So, you know, when you start looking at what's really within your control, it keeps getting whittled down and down and down. So any questions there on the pie chart?
Lynn or Zach, has the PSERS rate been fixed yet? I know there was some discussion that may get changed as well.
So the PSERS rate is fixed for next year for school districts. I think what you're referring to, there's some discussion about whether or not the rate that certain classifications of employees would have to contribute would change. But there's no impact as of right now to the actual school district's portion. I think it's 34.91% off the top of my head for next year.
Zach, just a little bit of a different topic, and this can be something for later. Can we have a conversation, whether it's in the committee or wherever, about the cost of athletics and how that's broken down? And like I said, it can be, the next meeting or whatever.
Depending on time here tonight, we can get into that. We also have on our website a link to each department budget, and one of those that we included is the athletics and activities budget, which is also interesting how it's broken down. But certainly we could have a conversation later. All right. So at this point, let's get into a little bit of our cost drivers. And again, like I said earlier, we're going to do this two ways. We're going to look at the last 4 years, meaning 18-19 through our 21-22 budget year. There's two ways we analyze budgets: budget to budget or actual to budget. There's pros and cons to both. I prefer, and I'll explain this a little bit later, for apples to apples, you look at a budget to a budget or an actual to an actual. It gets a little complicated when you look at a historical prior year actual to a future year budget, because we do budget conservatively. So any increases in line items, typically the increase by percentage is going to look greater when you compare a prior year actual to a future year budget, because we do typically come in under budget. We'll talk about that a little bit. But just for some highlights here, in the 2018-19 school year, we budgeted $109,700,000, came in at $104,799. If you look at our budget for next year, $117,508, and we didn't include any federal COVID grants because that's going to be offset. The one-time costs will be offset by one-time revenues from the grant money. The increase from an actual to budget is 12% over that 4-year period, of 3% per year. But if you look at it from a budget to budget perspective, again, knowing that we're most likely, and we'll look at it a little bit later here, going to come in under budget, the actual increase averaged about 1.8% over that 4-year period. And I do have a note here, and we'll look at the details of this later. We typically, over a 10-year period, the average was about 2.6 million that we came in under budget. The reason I said 2 to 2.5 million, there's some, anomalies over that 10 years that, I think bumped that number up a little bit. So I like to look at it more like a $2 million underspend, if you want to consider it that way. And then this is just a visual, same information. We've talked about this every year in the budget process. When you start your budget, really, even though the board sees it in February, Lynn and I and the department start this process in October. There are so many things you don't know. So the blue line represents our preliminary budget, the most conservative, and then we start to come down a little bit from there. And then the gray is our actual spend. And obviously, you always want to spend less than you budgeted for. So historically speaking, as a school district, we've done very good in that regard. And then Lynn, if you just want to talk a little bit about.
Can you go back to that slide?
Yep, I'm sorry.
So what I want to highlight for you guys, I think is the real, so gray being actual expenditures. So against the final budget being red. And you can see this gap that has developed, and you can see this gap that has developed in 2018, 19, and 20. It's a fairly significant looking gap. We can agree to that, right? I want you to highlight this gap over here in the 2021. It's a much smaller gap if you were just a visual person, representing several millions of dollars there. So I thought that stood out pretty powerful. And then the other thing that I look at is is really the 2020, 21, 22 is the blue column of expenditures or preliminary budget that we submitted.
And
I'd be interested to see what the final budget comes in, and it theoretically, does that gap still exist?
And one of the things you might notice is the blue in 21 is slightly lower than 2021. The reason for that is in 2021, we spent the 2 million from the sale of school, so it was a one-time, a little bit higher of a spike. So that blue line, if you remove that, you know, it changes even a little bit more.
But that gray column, to Keith's point, though, that gray column is still projected. We don't know what the final elevation of that gray column will actually be. So I appreciate your concern, Keith, and it's a valid concern. We certainly want to keep our eye on it. But at this point in time, we don't know if that gap's going to come down or not. Just as a matter of, you know,
So,
fact.
yeah, to Keith, or to Ron and Keith's point too, you know, it makes sense to then, you know, act as if that orange line is what our budget's going to be. And then, you know, if we have that extra, then that's our, that's
Yeah.
Don't
My
count
point
on it,
being
but-
this, this gap between the final budget and the is really where your fund balance increase is coming from, Ron. So, which is healthy today.
No, I get it. I get it.
And that's where, you know, consideration for, and the actual expenditures is what we're approving. Everything we approve to spend is where that it hits that. So we want to add a teacher, this, that, and the other thing. It comes all out of that gray zone.
Any other questions on this slide? So Lynn, if you can run through this. What Lynn did is she extracted, you know, the major cost drivers for all these. So she'll talk a little bit about what the process was she took and what the results were here.
Okay, this slide compares your 18-19 actual to our 21-22 preliminary budget numbers. Again, like Zach said, 18-19 was really the last quote unquote normal year, and that's why we selected that as a comparison point. So what this just shows you is out of the total difference between the 18-19 actual, or 18-19 actual and our 21-22 preliminary, it's about $13 million. If you, it's sort of a little bit below the middle of the slide, it says total increase, 10.1 million. We accounted for 10.1 million of the $13 million difference in basically non-discretionary items. Again, we included student transportation in non-discretionary at this point. We have contractual items like salaries and benefits in there. Food service loss, which has to be covered by the general fund by law. Substitute teachers, items like that. So we accounted for, like I said, a little over $10 million of the difference in the non-discretionary items. And then below, we have some discretionary items which changed over the 4-year period, software, and we listed capital projects. That's kind of I don't want to say not accurate, but it's really due to a timing difference. We budget $1 million basically every year to spend on these capital projects. And if they don't get completed in one fiscal year and they get carried over into the summer, the expenditures follow the fiscal year. So a lot of the differences you'll see in that category would be just timing of when the projects are actually completed. Off to the right, you see there are 2 links, which really dives into more of the detail if you want to look at that. So we just picked out some of the largest items to show the differences.
Link, can I ask a question just so I understand the administration thinking here? Is the plan to, because you keep talking about going back and looking at the normal year 18-19, is the plan to budget for the coming year on the assumption that it's going to be more like a normal year, and then adjust? Is that the thought?
No, not
Because what I'm
necessarily.
asking is what happens if, we have to,
Yeah, I think it depends on the line item, Brian.
Yeah.
So certain things we have and certain things we haven't. So something like charter schools enrollment, we haven't gone all the way back to what it was in 1819. We
No,
did
we,
halfway.
we assumed about half of the students who left to go to cyber will come back next year. That's just an assumption at this point. We don't know. So no, we're not assuming that next year is going to be a year like 1819. We're just using it for comparison purposes.
I was just kind of curious on where the thinking was. and
Yeah,
how
so
that was-
so some things have, some things haven't. I think from a educational instructional perspective, a lot of those budgeting line items have gone back to where you would traditionally see them,
Mhm.
which has created some of the variances from when you look at like a 1-year cost driver perspective, because we're budgeting for those things as if we're going to be back full time, and that's the normal educational model next year. But things that are a little outside of our control. And the other thing that's not factored in here, Brian, is that because we have we're expecting about $5.2 million in the federal funding, anything that might be out of the ordinary next year will be added to the budget or supplementing the budget possibly after the fact, but it would be offset by federal funds. So it'd have no net impact on the budget from an operational perspective. So in other words, if there's some kind of mandate from the state that we get in June and it costs us $300,000 to do X, Y, and Z, well, we'll supplement the budget after it's approved by $300,000, but you're allowed to do that because you're going to pay for it with $300,000 of federal funds. So some of those unknowns we haven't accounted for, knowing we have that safety net, if you will, from the federal funding that we expect to receive.
Thank you.
Any questions on this or any interest in any of the links there where we have some of the detailed items?
Zach, I did get news last night from the tech school that the bond is going to be up for, I guess you could
Yeah, it's callable next year, so
Next
they'll be
year,
looking
yeah.
at refinancing it. Yeah, I'm
So
aware.
I don't know if that changes any of the figures. I assume you wouldn't estimate what future interest rates would be, but
Not at this point. No, once they get to that point, we would be, our financial advisor, PFM, we would be consulting with them. I think the tech school uses them as well as a financial advisor, which is nice.
Zach, in the presentation that was sent out on our, these links that I wasn't able to open up these links.
Okay.
Yeah, neither was I.
It was able to, so can you zoom in on that?
Yeah,
Please,
so
a
there's two here. I'll just open them up in two different. So the first one here, let me make it a little bigger so you can actually read it. Lynn just went through, and correct me where I'm wrong here, Lynn, but picked out our largest overall line items, not necessarily largest cost drivers from an increase perspective, just largest cost drivers in general, and the
Yes.
percent of the total budget that they make up.
Yes, that's correct.
So then what we did, and you can see that she has them broken down in different categories, really nice here. And then what we did is anywhere where we saw these major increases over the 4-year period, we broke it down even further here. And anywhere, like some of the percentages I didn't worry too much about because if it was a large percentage, but it was like $2,000, I didn't, that wasn't something that I thought was noteworthy. But anything that I thought required some kind of a note or justification, it's not super detailed, but it does include areas that we thought you would want to know a little bit in terms of why. And that goes all the way down through from salaries and benefits down to food service losses. So I know I'm scrolling around here, but if there's anything that anybody had any questions about, I apologize if the link didn't work we did convert it to a PDF because we were still working in the PowerPoint itself. So maybe the PDF links didn't work when it was sent out.
Yeah, if possible, could you email those to us then?
Well, it should be okay now because the
Okay.
presentation is on the website and in board docs.
The one in board docs didn't work. Actually, the PDF worked.
Oh, okay. I'll have to check on that then. We'll make sure both are available just for redundancy purposes then.
Yeah.
So I don't know how.
So
What you wanna
I
look at
want to
here.
highlight one of the things. So this came up when I was reviewing this with Zach over the last couple of days. If you go up to the top, there's administrative costs, and it looks like there's been a pretty significant increase. So what I did was went through and looked at things that were high percentage and high increases. I asked Zach specifically about that. That was, although the number's totally high, it was a reclass of individuals who already had their salaries baked in elsewhere, and that then show up on that particular line item when we as the board approved different positions to be elevated from, let's say, a teacher position to a special assignment, or a special assignment to a vice principal position, things along those lines. Then their entire salary was grouped into that line item. Is that correct, Zach?
Yeah. So in other words,
Not
it's
just the increase that they got.
correct. When we do when I work on the salaries and benefits budget, I don't focus so much on the individual categories as much as the bottom line. So if there's budget code errors, I don't always pick up on them because that's not typically my focus when I'm going through that exercise. So I'll give you a simple example. In 18-19, that's the year our facilities director resigned. We brought in an interim facilities director. Well, they don't get classified under staff salaries because they're not a staff member. They get classified under professional services. So then the next year when we hired our facilities director, it now gets put back into the proper category, and now looks like that line item was increased by a higher percentage than it really was from a total budget perspective. So the big change there, and I did provide to Mr. Cucci a little more detail, and I can always share that with the rest of the board if they're interested, exactly how that worked. And it's primarily for 4 different people, either a reclassification or a coding error, if you will, that we never picked up on until after the year concluded.
Do you have a placeholder in there for the new transportation coordinator too?
So in this specific presentation, I don't. However, we did have a teacher retirement. So the difference between the teacher at the top and the new teacher, the salary difference there would be pretty close to the salary of the transportation. So I haven't updated it yet, but it wasn't material enough to update the entire salaries and benefits budget. But I will have an updated salary and benefits budget before the final budget vote. I try to wait till closer to the end of the year because then I know more of the retirements, resignations, anybody who might want to extend a child rearing leave or is requesting a leave. It's not something I update on a daily or weekly basis. So I do expect salaries and benefits to come down slightly based on a few staffing notifications that we received in the last couple of weeks though.
And does that have administrative bonuses baked in at 100% just to?
I don't go. Actually, I don't want to say for sure because I'm not sure off the top of my head. I don't think I go all the way to 100%. I think I look at what the percent was over the last 3 years and use something closer to that. But I'm also conservative, so I wouldn't be surprised if I used 100%, knowing it's not going to be so necessarily 100%. So.
And for the rest of the board, they're not bonuses, they're performance incentives that are tied with our administrative team to their salaries. They generally have a lower salary than their peers in other districts. And they, due to their outstanding performance, they can make up the difference on an annual basis, but that's not tied to their base salary.
What he said. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a PSERS specific definition, so you have to be careful with what you call it. And then, there's other things in here, like we just had a custodian retire, and by contract, the custodian position moves to SSC. So I'll take it out of salaries and benefits up top, and I would put the additional cost of the new FT in our custodial contract down below in support or in professional services. So that's how some of the numbers can look a little funny when you look at it over a 4 or 5 year period of time. But as I said, please feel free to go through. I think we have another finance committee meeting in a couple of weeks, so we can always if you have something that you're burning to ask a question on when you get time to go through it, we can obviously do that at that point as well. Any more questions on this slide? Okay. So we did the same exercise then, just from the current year to next year. Not quite as useful in some ways, because obviously COVID year, another potential COVID year, and the impacts of that on our budget. But we still wanted to go through the exercise. And we'll just look at it from the same numbers perspective here. So, you know, we budgeted in 2021, less the sale of the proceeds from the schools to try to get apples to apples, 116,872,000. We're budgeting next year, again, less COVID costs that are offset by grants, 117,508. So the actual budget to budget increase is 0.5%. If you look at it from where we're expecting to spend here to the budget, it's 2.4. So I know the question is going to be, well, how do we have, if we're not spending any more money, at least on a budget to budget perspective, why do we still have about a $2 million deficit at the Act 1 index? And the answer is pretty simple, is because we had a deficit in our current year going into the year, and the tax increase was 0%. So the deficit just keeps getting carried over. We didn't cover it fully in the current year, so we're still dealing with the deficit in the future year. I don't know if you can say that any more eloquently, Lynn, but that's pretty much the explanation for why we're still seeing a deficit without really an increase in expenditures.
Well, and
Yes,
the other question that does come up too is, with less students each year, why does the budget keep going up?
So we can get into some of the
Well,
details
that's why we're having the discussion tonight, Chris. And Keith asked, because if you want to add more things into it, like full day K, renovations and things, just with all our designated costs, you're in the discretionary areas, and to do that, you have to raise taxes.
And some of the things really have no correlation to student enrollment either. So for example, $500,000 in food service losses has nothing to do with student enrollment, or the amount of students, well, I guess this one's kind of tied to enrollment, but the amount of students who left to go to a cyber charter school, well, that actually has an increased cost instead of a reduction when those students are no longer part of our school district. So, you know, you can get into all the ins and outs of the reasons why, but, you know, we really would have to go through every single line item and explain which ones are tied to student enrollment and which ones aren't. Utilities, really, you know, we spend $1 million in utilities. Well, all the buildings are still running. They might have less students in them, but, you know, so we have seen a reduction in FTEs though. So there is a correlation between the reduction in FTEs and the reduction in student enrollment. And when you look at that line item, it's relatively flat over the last couple of years. So in other words, all the staff got increases contractually, but the line items haven't actually gone up because they were offset by a reduction in staff. So some of those things that are tied to student enrollment, you know.
As our enrollment has declined from about 5,500 students to 48, a little bit over 4,800, we have each year taken out FTEs or positions out of the inventory to help us balance our budget. And that's one of the primary reasons we didn't have a tax increase last year.
So then we did the same exercise as we did with the 4-year for a 1 year. And before I hand it over to Lynn, I just want to point out one thing, and this is where it can get a little dangerous when you compare a projected actual or an actual to a future year budget, especially in a odd year like we're having this year with COVID, because we're underspending in a lot of our accounts this year because of, you know, whether there's a number of students in virtual, you know, number of days in the beginning of the year that were virtual, whatever it might be. And then you compare the future year, which we're expecting in a lot of ways to go back to normal. Well, just because we save those costs this year, we don't expect to save those costs again next year. So it looks like there's an increase, but when you look at it from a budget to budget perspective, there really isn't. So if Lynn, do you want to just kind of walk through what you pulled out for this?
Sure. This slide is similar to 2 slides ago, I think, except this one compares the 2021 budget to our 21-22 budget, like Zach said. And again, what we did here was we pulled out large cost drivers, large dollar items. And the top part lists out a lot of non-discretionary items and the percentage increase year to year. And we accounted for $4.9 million of increase in non-discretionary items. And then down in discretionary books increased by just under $200,000.
And that's a prime example of, well, for a lot of there's a lot of students this year that are in a virtual environment. So we didn't purchase as many physical, books, materials, supplies, whatever it might be, as we would in a normal year. So
Yes.
here's a normal year. So we're expecting to have to purchase that again. It's not a true increase in our budget from a budget to budget sense. So.
Correct. Yeah, we're looking at projected numbers compared to our preliminary budget for next year. And we are projecting to be under budget in several categories because of the hybrid situation.
And I can give you another example, and Janet can speak to this a little bit. She had a meeting with Lynn and I think that was last week, and updated us on where she thinks she's going to fall this year in her budget, and told us that for the current year, she'll probably be underspending. And we asked the question, well, okay, does that mean you're going to alter your budget for next year? And she had a very good reason why. And I don't know if Janet, if you just want to, just as an example, I think it was in the outplacements or one of those line items, if you just want to explain how the philosophy, works.
Sure.
there.
So ESSER funds covered some of the contracted costs with mental health, as well as behavior specialists and registered behavior technicians. So they won't be, they may or may not be covering them next year. So I did put those in. And also, I'm sure you've heard at previous board meetings that behavior incidents have been down, and with having less students in the building. So we have not had to outplace any students this year. If we're back full time next year, I'm not sure that will be continue to be the case. So I kept my budget the same as it was previously.
And there's many examples. Substitute
Do you
teachers,
have
is
a
another one.
projection of what that decrease is like this year?
What was that, Keith? I didn't hear the last part.
So you said, Janet, you said you were going to come in under budget this year. What amount of that? By $500,000, $1 million?
I think what I gave Lynn the other day was about $300,000.
That's not
Can you make it
included in
5?
these numbers.
Right.
Can you make it 5?
I'll try.
No, I'm joking around. Here's the reason I asked the question, because if we're under budget one year, that money then gets added to the fund balance.
Yep.
And so if we're going to, and we raise, at least my philosophy is, I raise based on the fund balance ultimately, right? Because that fund balance puts you in a healthy position to borrow, puts you in a healthy position as a district. If we're going to add to that, like we did 2 years ago, where it was several millions of dollars, then increasing taxes, I know for the long haul, it doesn't, that philosophy doesn't work, and you have to be cautious with that long haul. But if we're going to then take some money out of that to help repay next year, that should offset having the balanced taxes or erase taxes significantly. So it would be nice to know where we sit with that, so that at the end of the year, because I don't like putting $2 or $3 million into the fund balance every year continuously. I don't think that's healthy for taxpayers, for essentially the district to have a major savings account. So I think that we just have to, I just would like to know what that looks like, because that'll help, at least it'll help me in my mind put into context where we need to be tax-wise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this next slide is going to highlight that a little bit. And what I would, I guess, say to that is, you hear me say it, you've heard me say it the last couple of years. I am okay going into a future year's budget with a deficit, but only up to a certain level, because, again, school districts are budgeting before you have all the information. You're always going to be risk adverse. and conservative when you're building that budget. So what we did is, this one might get cut off a little bit, I'm not sure if you can see it. We looked at the last 10 years and we said, what was the average underspend over that 10 years? And it was about $2.6 million. And what I would point out is the last couple of years, I think, and there's very specific reasons for why that happened. So I wouldn't look at the 2.6 million. I would look at it more like a 2 million because, well, I'll just go to the next slide. It'll tell you. So the large numbers in the last couple of years are correlated to three things: the closure of Milford Middle School, the closure of Tican Valley, and then obviously last year we were closed for COVID for 3 years. And you're gonna probably ask me, well, why the closure of the schools? It's primarily in salaries and benefits because we, as a school district and a school board, had decided back then we weren't going to furlough any staff. So in the budget, there was no reduction other than the staff that we knew. And then after those decisions were made, staff resigned, retired, slowly made those decisions, and then we didn't backfill them through attrition. So we budgeted for them. As they resigned, we didn't backfill them. So naturally, we had a larger underspend than we would normally see.
Yeah, there's something to say though, to Keith's point though, is it's nice to have a healthy fund balance, but you know, how big does it have to be? The only reason I raised that issue is when I first got on the board almost 7 years ago now, our fund balance was 15 million, thereabouts. Now it's, you know, dang near 25 million. And, you know, the case can be made, well, our budget's increased, so, you know, 8% of, you know, 90 million is a lot different than 8% of 120 million. So maybe we do need to raise it, but that's something to be aware of when we're putting this budget together, is how much of a fund balance do we need? And we say we're going to need to tap in. If we don't raise taxes high enough, we're going to have to tap into our fund balance. Well, we may have had to tap into our fund balance, but it's still getting bigger every year. It's still getting bigger. So something to think about.
Yeah, and there are some, it's a balancing act, right? But there are some numbers that I can give you that, like Lynn and I do Moody's rating calls a couple of times a year, every time we have a refinancing, and what they like to see typically is at least 2 months worth of your budget in fund balance. So I know that differs from state laws. So, you know, 8.5% can be undesignated, and the rest you have to designate for certain things. But Moody's doesn't really care what pot of money it's in. They're looking at how much money do you have in fund balance, and it's about you know, no less than 2 months before you start getting into you know, some level of a concern from a credit rating, which has its pros and cons. If you need to borrow money in the future, you know obviously you're going to get a lower rate. I think, Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, we saved about 2.5 million in the last 2 years on refinancing because we took advantage of low interest rates and our good credit rating. So it's a balancing act. It absolutely is. So, and that's where I always say, if you know, if we're going into the next school year with a deficit, budgeted deficit, where we have to use fund balance, I'm perfectly fine with that. And we've seen, you know, I always throw out a number somewhere between 1 and 2 million. If we were raising taxes to cover everything, so you didn't have to use full fund balance, then I think I would obviously agree with you there, Ron. Then if we know we're going to come in under, why are we raising taxes all the way up to cover the entire deficit? So obviously we don't do that because the last couple we've budgeted for use of fund balance, and it's a balancing act. Any questions on the last couple of slides?
And what is the fund balance again? It's like 22, 24, something like that, right?
So at the end of this year, Lynn's projecting about a
23.4 million.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Lynn?
23.4 million is our current projection for the end of this year, but that can change.
Right.
With $118 million budget. So you got a calculator there in front of you, don't you,
It's
Brian?
about,
5% of 20, I'm sorry,
it'd be
20%.
about $20 million. So we're a little over that mark.
Yeah.
Lynn, I don't know if you want to go through this just quickly. The board has seen this multiple times. We've kind of talked about it already, but just what the impact has been, and it directly correlates to the large fund balance increases over the last couple, really last year, I should say, not the last couple of years, but last year.
Okay, the first column gives you expenditure increases from 1920 to 2021. Big one is the $1.7 million in charter school tuition that we've paid out. Food service losses, we're projecting $500,000 for this current year. We did bring that projection down to $200,000 for next year, hoping that we're in a more quote unquote normal situation, but we're still projecting a loss, and we have that in our budget. The middle column shows some savings that we actually incurred due to closing the schools in March of 2020 for 3 months. We saved on contracted subs. We saved a little bit on transportation and fuel, things like that. We saved in supplies and books because kids were not in school, so we saved some money there. And a little bit in utilities as well, because the buildings were basically empty. The last column shows some expenditures that we expect to continue into next school year. We're projecting food service losses, like I said, of $200,000. So that's less than what we project for this year, but we're still projecting a loss. We're still expecting a rather high charter school tuition cost. We are expecting, I think, about half of the students who left to go to cyber charter schools to come back next year. So that number does come down a little bit from this year, but it's still a higher cost than in a pre-pandemic year. And of course, we're expecting to spend more money on COVID-related supplies, a lot of which would be covered by grant funds. Any questions?
All right, so now we'll get into some of the long-range planning pieces here, and what we like to do or what we don't like to do is look at our budget in an individual year, because as everybody knows, you know, as school districts are limited to the Act 1 index in terms of raising revenue for future years. So whatever decision you make now regarding taxes, you'll never get that money back in a future year. So you got to make sure, depending on what you want as a board over the next 5 years, you are planning to cover those costs through the appropriate amount of millage or tax increases, or making decisions on you know, expense reductions, depending on how you want to approach that process. But anyway, here, what I have here is I just kind of compiled a list of everything I've heard either the board or individual board members or just individuals in general talking about. It might even be something that's going on in the community as a hot topic, and just identified them as, hey, these are things that aren't really built into our budget right now, but if we're going to make decisions about these as a board, as an administration going forward, they're not likely going to hit our budget next year, and I can explain some of the reasons why when you look at these, but they certainly will in the outward years. So the big question is, you know, how much risk do you want to take with some of these things? What's that balance look like in the outward years? And we have declining enrollment. Obviously we've been talking about that. We've built conservatively into the outward years of our budget a reduction of 2 FTEs per year. You know, most likely could be more, but then if you look at the number 2 bullet, we've had a lot of conversations, and I've heard a lot of board members talking about class size restrictions. So, you know, you can't say you're going to reduce FTEs because you have declining enrollment, but then turn around and have restrictions on class sizes because you got to use those FTEs to reduce the class size numbers. So, you know, that's bullet number 2. Obviously, QE renovation and what that would look like. We'll show you some scenarios in a minute here. We don't have the reports back by Schrader Group and Dewey Engineering. We expect to have them back in the next couple of weeks here. And then we'll have more information to work off of and to build into scenarios for our budget. School start times, we've talked a lot about that, which, you know, face value, it doesn't seem like there's a cost implication there, but if you go to a 2-tiered system, you need more buses than you would need now, so that's a cost. We have been working really hard with Levy School Bus and to come up with this, what we're calling a 2.5-tiered system, where we can share based on the start times, some of the buses between 2 tiers. So some buses would be a 2-tier and some would be a 3-tier. But I built in, I use the number 350,000. It's would obviously be contingent on how many buses we would need. I think that represents about 6 or 7 additional buses, in addition to the 2.5-tier. About 6 buses that we've already worked into this budget. Cyber charter, obviously, we've had a lot of conversations about that. A baseball field, depending on what the board wants to do when we have the study back, we're going to get some options, and depending on what option the board likes, the way you would fund that could be many different things. And then universal full day K in all buildings, and how you would implement something like that if you were going to. So most of these, would hit us in 22, 23 if decisions were made, not in 21, 22. So if you're looking at, the reason I highlight that, if you're looking at next year as an individual year, if you ask me right now, do we need an Act 1 index tax increase? I would say no, we do not. But my recommendation or answer would change significantly depending on some of these future decisions that the board would be making. Because again, you're never going to make up the lost revenue in the future. So if you're not planning to cover those future costs through revenue right now, we could be in a very tough decision-making process, 4, 5, 6 years from now. And what we did is we just kind of.
Zach,
yeah.
1 second, please. As an example, 10 years ago, when the board committed to renovating the high school, they did not set aside any of their budget for capital improvements and of the high school for the renovation. In turn, it squeezed the district, even though we were attriting teachers out with our declining enrollment. It caused that squeeze that resulted in the short term, very short term, of closing 2 schools without notice, almost without notice. We did not do that for Nidec. We set aside the money for it, the placeholders in the budget to pay for the bonds. And in turn, with all the other things we got going on, we're in an excellent place. So that's the kind of counsel Zach's giving, perfect counsel on what you need to be thinking about for the future. So if renovations, if you're going to not use fund balance, use bonds, then we need to set it aside.
Zach, I had a question on your last slide that you kind of glossed over this, the cyber charter enrollment, that we have planned on using the ESSER funds in the short term. Don't most, isn't that a reoccurring budgetary item? So isn't that something that we're not supposed to be using those one-time grants on? Because
so maybe you're so maybe you're a little confused. We're not planning to use the ESSER funds to pay for charter school costs. The ESSER funds that we would be using in our plan would be to fund our own virtual program, and the cost is per student. And Lisa and I have had many conversations about this. The plan could change. It could change significantly depending how many students would want that option. The thought process here, and Lisa can correct me where I'm wrong, is let's take advantage of the funding in the first year and stop the bleed and try to get students back. As we get back to a normal environment, the number of kids that would be selecting a cyber program would go down and would be offset by bringing the cyber charter kids back in-house. So you'd be paying for some of that by bringing students back in. Now, Lisa will tell you, if you have 1,000 kids that say they want cyber, obviously this plan doesn't work because we'll go broke. We can't afford it anymore. So I don't know if Lisa, if that, if you wanted to add to that, but
Yeah, I think, I've also been working with Lynn, who shared some information with me on who we actually have in cyber charters. I spoke to a parent just about an hour ago who has 2 special education students currently in outside cyber charters and wants to bring them back to live instruction. That's a significant savings out of that budget. But I also had a parent who sent me an email a half an hour ago who, was their student is in live instruction and they want to move to cyber. So it's always fluid. I think the general hope is that as many students as we can get out of pay for cyber charters into our own, which is looking to projected cost is about 1/3 of what we're paying to outsource. And then as I can slowly have the conversations with the families and try to transition them back, which I'm hoping won't take a full year, then we can see that cost come down even more.
So is the desire mostly for cyber school to, have a virtual learning experience? Or is it to not be in the public school district to go to a private charter school?
So
What is the
for- I guess-
motivation for leaving primarily, I guess?
Sure. There's two different tracks of people. There's the people who left this past year, and all of their questions for me are COVID related. Will my kids still have to wear a mask? Will they have a shortened school day? Some of those things I can answer, and some of them I can't, because if we're under a mandate for their child to wear a mask, then that's what we're going to have to do. But most of those parents that I've spoken to appear to be interested in having their child return to live instruction and school. They left only because of things that were related mostly to our change in schedule for COVID, not knowing about whether we were going to ever come back to school live and hybrid, those kind of things. Then we have a population of individuals who have selected cyber for many years. And, we're hoping that we can interest them in coming back. Some of them may say, no, we're happy with where we are. And, there's that kind of conversation. I'm not sure though, and I think this is what Zach was talking about, we're not sure how many virtual families right now have just embraced their child being virtual and want to keep them that way. That's the missing piece of the number that I don't know. And I'm hopeful that the blog that Dr. Hunter just sent out asking for people to share their information with me will give me a better indication of that number. But like Zach said, if it's really high, then we're gonna have to pivot and come up with a new plan, because we can't spend that kind of money.
So has there been outreach to families that left to go to private non-charter schools as well? Like I said, I know Faith Christian's enrollment ballooned greatly this year. So, and not just Faith Christian, some of the other private schools. And I know that's not necessarily a good budget thing for the district, but it could bring more of our students back.
We'll be reaching out to the people we lost that are under 11th grade or 12th grade, at who we lost between last year and this year. But when someone goes off to a private school, it's not a loss of revenue to us. We don't want to see them leave us, because frankly, we have the best program in town and in the region. So, and we have bragging rights on that, and they've been earned by our teachers and by our students. So we will be sending out letters between Lisa and I. Will be working on that.
Yeah,
Did I-
there's
I'm
quite a
sorry.
few too that chose to register their children for kindergarten the first year into those private schools. And some of it, like Dr. Hoffman mentioned, were for masking. Some of the private schools have been a little bit more liberal about their mask exemptions. So that's why some families had left for there. Some have been, maybe expressed, or maybe they thought that they would have more of a full day kindergarten. That's why they went there. So do we even have a way to contact those families that didn't register their kids for our kindergarten, but did to a private, or I don't even know if charters offer kindergarten, but
Only if they've had children with us and then they disappeared.
so,
If they're new to the community, have never been with us before, then no.
okay.
So Lisa,
Maybe I'm
how do you
misunderstanding.
plan to market the new virtual component of our district?
Well, the first marketing, it goes out as soon as if you approve it next week. That's what we're asking for. In my blog, I asked for everyone to contact the board, and I'm looking at my emails. They're coming in. Parents are already talking about full day K. So Brian, you'd appreciate that one. You've probably seen it already.
I just saw it, yeah.
Then we'll market it after the board makes a decision on start times and our intent for planning for next year, which is
Actually,
next week.
I'm sorry, but I think you already started, because your blog starts to talk about what you're planning on asking. So I think that's the first step that you've taken. And I think it's a good one.
This is true, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it's a good first step, and it's but
And we've also put the information out there at the intersection of 663, 309, and 313.
I saw that.
We'll use that with our flex model.
I saw that. And Chris kind of asked about my question about the kindergarten enrollment and things like that, but did I misunderstand before we were talking about reaching out to those families? Did I misunderstand that we were going to do a sort of like a survey to those families, or maybe that's the letter you're talking about? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Explain, sir.
I
Excuse me.
thought I remembered us talking about doing a survey for the people who have chosen charter or cybers to see about their interest in coming back. Now,
Well,
excuse me,
saying in a
maybe that's
survey,
that letter you were mentioning. I'm not sure.
Yeah, yes, sir. We're not going to be surveying. We're going to be letting them know what we'll be doing, what our purpose is, their options, and hoping if they've really enjoyed the virtual cyber school option in charter, that they choose us and take advantage of all the other things that we have going on in the district and our other resources. Counseling as an example, sports as an example, and that way, but not doing a survey.
And
Thank you. I must have misunderstood that.
All right, can we finish going and then
Yeah.
get through the presentation?
So this slide right here, am I on mute? No. This slide right here is a visual representation of just what I was talking about, your decisions that you're going to be making this year and how they would impact the school budget in the outward years. And it's a little busy, so I apologize. Try to stay with me a little bit here. I think I referenced 6 or 7 different scenarios a second ago. I just took 3 that I think we've heard the most talk about. And Lynn and I attached some numbers to them. And what we did is, we did 2 different scenarios. One scenario is next year, so the budget you would approve in June would be 1.75%, and then you'll see the next scenario is full Act 1 at 3.5%, and then tax increases every year thereafter for the next 4 years. And the 3 scenarios within that are implementing a universal full day K. And Brian, this what we used was if you remember at the last Finance Committee for this one, not all in 1 year. It was the one that we would slowly, the start time change, so the additional buses, and then a QE renovation. I don't know what the cost is. Yet I use 15 million because that's the number we threw around before. So when you start to compound those, if you look all the way at the top, 25-26 school year, the gold line would be your operational deficit in 25-26. So it's over $4 million. That would be if you did all 3 and you started to implement that in 22-23. So you can see, as you implement 1, then you implement 2, then you implement the 3rd scenario, how the operational deficit increases over the next 4 years.
Zach, is that with the tax increases, correct?
So I don't know what the Act 1 will be. Lynn and I used 3%, 2.8, 2.5, 2.5. So the idea was the Act 1 would be less in the outward years because of the financial situation that we just went through.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but if you open up the detailed sheet, there's a link there that gives you all the dollars and all of the assumptions that we made. Yeah. That might be helpful.
This shows the math.
Shows the math, and it shows exactly what we added to each year in expenditures and what we used for Act 1 for each year.
And it also shows the fund balance.
Understand. Let's go back to the slide a second, though.
Yep.
So in 25-26, we would have a greater than $4 million deficit, even raising taxes to the top of the game for the next 5 years.
Correct.
But Keith, this year we have a $7 million deficit. So puts it into perspective.
It's more like 5. But
yeah, I would take more like 5.2, Chris, just because the 2 million of the 7 was from using the school. So if you think about it as an operational deficit.
Because I disagree with you on one point, Keith, because I'm looking at the assumptions here and they've only assumed a 1.7 for this year, for example, which would be about half of the Act 1. So
yeah.
That's not what I said. That's not what I said. What I said was you're going to have a $4 million plus deficit over 5 years.
1.25. Yeah.
That you're going to, and remember the administration said they're comfortable going with a $2 million deficit.
Yes.
going full taxes for the next 5 years.
But that's what I'm saying. It doesn't look like it's full taxes for the next 5 years, if only because of that first year, they're only going at half.
Yeah, so the only difference is in year one. So in
Right.
other
All
words,
all
what
I'm
it
saying,
shows-
Brian, is this, you
Yeah.
can't, I don't think you can have your cake and eat it too in this scenario where this plays out. I don't think you can do everything you want and still, I don't know how you explain to a community when you have less kids involved in the school district, how you're constantly whacking their taxes. I just don't know how you explain that when you have less teachers, less kids enrolled. I mean, by substantial numbers. We're not talking about 25 kids less. We're talking like probably 600 kids over that same time period if the projection's right, correct?
Yeah, and I go back to an earlier slide. It all goes back to what level of risk do you want to take? So, could we remove more FTEs over the next 4 years? Probably, if the declining enrollment is exactly how it's projected to be. But then you can if we want to have smaller class sizes, and that's where it all depends. Again, and I'm not making any judgment calls on any of this. It's just we have to be aware. You never want to approve a budget in it. In a silo, 1 year budget, you got to think about the things that we're deciding. And again, $4 million, it might be less by 25, 26. Obviously we don't have a crystal ball. And I think Ron's point, if you don't want to get to a point where you're overtaxing, but 4 million, I would say from my perspective is too much in terms of a deficit that we would be able to overcome in an individual year.
So my specific question was about the start times in year
Yeah.
3, so 23, 24.
Sorry, they're not years, they're just scenarios. So it's not year 1, 2, and 3. It's just those are the.
No,
So
but on the chart here, what
Yeah.
looks like the projection for year 23, 24. Excuse me, the plus start time change seems to go down from the 22, 23 projection. Is that just because of what you're
So-
projecting as the tax increase for the year?
Correct. These are operational deficits. So because we have higher tax increases in 22, 23 and 23, 24 than we do in the outward years, the operational deficit it's not as great. And the reason, again, we started with higher numbers and went to lower is there's a formula that the state uses to determine what the Act 1 index is. And part of that is based on the average weekly wages of I think it's 3 years behind. So the impact of the pandemic will catch up with us in terms of how much you can raise taxes, but it won't be for a couple of years yet.
Right.
And Keith, what I was trying to mention is, looking at a projected loss of $4 million, in the next 5 years, we're looking at a projected loss, of 5 million this year. So, but all that's getting whittled down. We're making all those ends meet. That's what would more than likely happen as well. And plus, like he had mentioned too, there's $5.2 million in grant money there. So maybe that QE borrow is only 10 million instead of 15. Also coming into this, none of these, the universal full day kindergarten or smaller class sizes can't be accomplished without QE being done first. So, there's a lot of, you don't necessarily have to do all of these changes all right away at once too. They could be layered into there.
Just one quick mathematical thing.
No, Chris, I don't disagree with and I don't disagree with anybody.
Yeah,
What
no,
I'm just saying is, and what this finance committee right now is looking at doing is giving you what it looks like for the future.
Yeah.
Because what we do today does affect, just like we talk about every time we spend a dime in the school district, we have to understand what the long-term ramifications, whether it's adding a program, because a new board, may not be us, but a new board is going to be faced with trying to close that gap. Right. And that gap, this is a projection. And while we're all saying it can be lower, it could be much higher.
Mhm.
It could be higher. So I just think we got, and I don't disagree. Maybe the answer is you layer in stuff and see how it works. But once you start all day kindergarten, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, you're not taking it back. So, once that genie's out of the bottle, I think it's out. So I'm not opposed to it. I'm just saying you're going to have to make it up somewhere.
No, and I get that. And I think you're right. I think, there's a lot of things that we're talking about here. And when I brought up the idea of full day K, for example, I wanted to see how it kind of played out. This is exactly what I was kind of asking for. But then we also have other factors, the refinancing, the as Chris mentioned, that grant money and all that. So, we don't know how that's going to impact, and that could be something that helps us or hurts us.
I do agree to some extent, but anybody who in your life has ever, been promised a job with a bonus incentive, you never count your bonus as a potential because it's not there year over year.
Right.
Right. So, that it doesn't make up what your daily operation costs are. So we can't hang our hats on the fact that there may be grant money out there, or, this year they spent $1 trillion and, they're printing money in Washington right now. We're just benefiting from it to some
Right.
extent. It's got to
No,
stop.
I don't disagree. And I don't want to hijack this. I just wanted to see how this plays out and see how we can invest into our students a little bit more than we are.
Another way to clarify Keith's point too is back in the 90s, I remember I was out at State College, and I remember walking late at night to this place called Burritos the Size of Your Head. And I went up to that place and I was like, I'm going to get this burrito the size of my head. And that's future Chris's problem, whatever the ramifications of that are. That's the road we don't want to go down, because I can tell you future Chris's problem was a lot greater than I thought it would be. So we want to plan ahead and have the correct, we want to be ready.
I think that's just a little bit more information than we needed.
We got the picture though. It's there.
Chris, I just want to correct maybe one thing on the ESSER funds. There are rules around how you can use that, and 20% of it has to be used towards learning loss. So you couldn't, even if you wanted to apply it all.
No, I know. I'm just saying, that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that 15 million.
Understood. But the other thing you have to remember is if we are going to try to bring back cyber kids, we have to use some of that money to build our cyber program. So you would then have to spend $1 million on the cyber program. If you know what I mean? Like
is there a startup cost with that, since it's being done by a third-party contractor?
It's Lisa can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's I forget how much it is per student, but it's a per student cost.
A per student, like tuition cost, or a startup cost as well?
No, we would
No,
be
just
using
per
existing
student, but
staff to oversee. Yeah.
It depends on how many students, like there's different bands. If you have this many students, it costs this. If you have this many students, it's a little bit less. But then of course it's less, but less for more students. So it's just a little hard to judge right now what it is, but there's no added fees, no enrollment fees, nothing like that. It's just a flat fee per student.
So that's the last slide. We do have all kinds of links here. If anybody is super bored and wants to go through all of them, they are all there. I know we didn't get to Brian Reimer's question about athletics, but the athletic budget is on the website. If we can always put that on as a an item for the May meeting. The only thing I want to bring up real quick.
Question on that, Zach, 1 second. Brian, are you looking for just total costs? Are you looking at for per sport budget, or what?
Well, a little bit of both. I'm looking at how the budget is allocated, like per sport. I'm looking at how funds are spent by each sport. And that's why I didn't necessarily need to.
We can make that information. I'll have Sylvia make that an information item for next week's board meeting.
Thank you.
And just so you have a little point of reference, when they went through the red light, green light, whatever it was, Nancy can talk about it. It's long before my time, or not, at least a couple of years before my time here. They took the budget way down. And it was like 3 years ago when we finally got it back to where it was back 10 years ago. and at least 10 years ago. And it's about $210,000 of what our athletic budget is for of resources that Sylvia works with all the teams. Now, as you know, as a baseball dad and sports enthusiast, and Keith and other board members, booster clubs do a lot of work. Fundraising does a lot of work, and parents have been incredible with that. I came from a budget, believe it or not, I came from a budget district not that much larger than us, 8,000 students, and their athletic budget was $1.25 million. I mean, their teams, when they went more than an hour for a drive, they went from Cumberland Valley up to State College for a game. They were on fancy buses. Ours is bare bones. The board has been very generous. We bought a lot of things through capital improvement when we renovated the high school, the improvements with building the sports complex, improvements out there at Alumni Field, Rob's actual sweat and that he gave us in helping build the visitor center at Alumni Field, the visitor locker room there. So it's the annual budget's right around a little bit over 200,000. I'll have it broken down by sport for you for next week.
So
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons I asked, because I did talk to the baseball guys, and they were talking about the relationship with the booster club to the sport, and I was just kind of curious how that played out across all the other sports as well.
And there's nuances. So like field costs and things like that won't be included in that budget. That's a different budget. And just as a quick FYI, I think it was last year, maybe the year before. It's probably the year before, because I think Keith was the chair of the finance at the time. The finance committee did increase, and it made it into the budget, the athletic budget for uniforms. So Sylvia created I forget how many years. It was sort of like the curriculum cycle, and decided which teams were going to get new uniforms in which years. So we gave them a little extra money for that, and also for transportation for certain activities.
So Zach, did you build? Oh, sorry. Did you build the pay to play back into these future budgets when you were projecting them? Okay, so that
we removed the revenue, and we didn't. Well, it's specifically removed for next year because the board already voted on that, and I don't believe we put it back in for any future year.
Zach, when we had the pay to play, what was the revenue stream?
Lynn, is it like 90,000, somewhere in that neighborhood?
I was going to say 80,000, but that's about right. Back to your question about the athletics thing, Brian. There is a report out on our website. I'm not sure exactly where it's located, but it's called Interscholastic Opportunities something report. That lists out a lot of information about all of the athletic teams at the middle school and at the high school. We're required to submit that every year. So that should be up on the website, and that would include information from last year.
All right, yeah, I'll look for that. I didn't see it, but I'll look. Thank you.
So question for Keith here. The next committee, and I guess Chris too, because our next finance and facilities committee meetings are May 6th. I want to say it's May 6th. Let me just double check.
Yeah, I believe so.
That is the night of the comprehensive plan steering committee presentations. Pretty much all of the administrators are presenting at that meeting, and I believe the board is invited to those meetings. So either we have to get creative on times that night, and I could work with Dr. Harner and Nancy, or we would consider rescheduling our committee meetings for a different night.
Hey Keith, could you do the 5th? The day before, or Wednesday's good for you?
And what I was gonna say, I don't think we should cancel them a week before the board's gonna vote on the proposed final budget. Otherwise, I would say we could skip one since we're having this tonight, but it's just so close to the budget presentation.
Before everybody gets ready to jump off here and talk about future, I want to just bring one topic up for everybody's perusal before we all jump away. Keith, one of the things you said a number of times is you've got to face community members in an effort to explain to them how our budget increases every year. We're constantly going after them for additional taxes. And at the same time, our student population is going down. The number of teachers employed is going down. And that's an excellent question. along the same lines as that question, I'm back on the original slides, Zach or Joe, if anybody wants to join me, I'm at slide number 11. Just to give you a quick point of reference, that's the cost driver for the 4-year trends. And Zach's and Lynn's slide showed a 10-year, 10.1 increase in the budget approximately over that 4-year term. And there's a number of cost drivers with various increases, but over half of that $10 million was salary and benefits, which raises the big question again. If we're constantly losing students and we're constantly paring away our teaching level due to attrition, how does that number keep going up? And there's an obvious answer to it. And I'm just, somewhere down the line, we're going to have to address that issue. And as a board and a community even, decide how we want to handle it. And I just want to point it out so that everybody, you know, especially Keith, to the points you make, no matter how much we're cutting back, we're still looking at an increase in that line item every year.
And I do want to point out.
I mean, I think there's a couple things you got to think about, right? So some of the things that we talked about early on, you know, was when we were looking to balance out that spend was, you know, we talked about I mean, we'll just take, for example, the last contract that we worked in, you know, it was a balancing act between, you know, so that line item didn't increase. We were going, you know, we thought through attrition, we would balance that out, but we can't balance that out if our answer is that we want 15 kids in a class. And let me be clear about something. I want to be crystal clear. And I've told Zach this, I would love to have everything. I would love to have smaller class sizes, all day kindergarten, delayed starts, a baseball field that works for our students. I would love to have everything. And if we could find a way to financially afford it without completely gouging, constantly going after our only revenue stream, it'd be great. It'd be awesome. But there's got to be give and take, and we've got to balance that act. I think we try really hard. I think this presentation set the stage for what's the tolerance level. The only thing I worry about is the future. You know, here and now. I mean, we like those, and I call them feel good votes. A lot of us vote for things that feel good, and sometimes they're not always. You know, we just have to. They're always good. We just have to make sure that we're understanding really what the long-term ramifications of those votes are. And until you get to a point where your hands are tied and it forces you to cut stuff, let's make sure before we spend, because everybody likes where we're at today as a district. The more we spend, we may reach a point where we're like, look, we're going to have to get rid of a program. We're going to have to funnel it down because we just can't financially afford it anymore. And I worry about pinning next board members down in the future for mandatory tax increases based on decisions we make today. So I just, you know, I'm not saying I'm not averse. I mean, I think my voting record is such that I don't mind raising taxes to benefit the students, but when you're doing things that, you know, we're doing it right today, it can be enhanced. I agree, but we can't have it all. We can't have everything, in my mind. So we got to pick and choose what we're willing to do in what we decide as a board is the best interest.
So I just want to make one point, and then we do have to get those meetings scheduled. But Ron, if you look at total salaries over that 4-year period, they've actually only gone up 6.4% over 4 years. The bigger driver is the benefits.
Right, but I
wasn't
speaking to any. I didn't speak to anything in that term salaries and benefits.
No, I know.
called it out
I
as a
didn't think,
term.
I figured that might be a surprise just for the board to see
Oh, no.
that.
I encourage everybody to go into the deeper things that Zach and Linda provided, because it's clear in there. If you look at what salaries have done over the past 4 years, they've been fairly flat, okay? But again, to Keith's point, if the population goes down and our teachers, the number of teachers to go down, did I freeze? Can you hear me?
No, you're
I
good.
can hear you.
We got
Okay,
you.
I just stopped
my
sharing,
froze
that's
on me. If we're losing teachers and we're losing students, then the question simply is, why isn't the salaries going down? Why isn't it? And great, you're right, Zach. Benefits are always going up. It's just the nature of things. PSERS has gone up forever. It's never going to stop. I don't care what they say. PSERS is never going to level off. It's never going to stop. So we're looking at that kind of stuff every year. But you have to be prepared when you're talking to citizens out there to let them know, we're not just, we don't dismiss anything they're saying. We're living under the constraints that are imposed upon us to a large degree.
Janet, can I
what are
ask a
your-
question? Janet, where'd you go? Are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
So do you have, and I know you don't have a crystal ball,
Mm.
but let me just put a scenario in front of you. As we know, this year has been a tough year on our students academically. We've had, the highest fail rates likely the history of Quakertown, given the current environment. We've made some of that up. Do you think that the special ed needs of our community, based on the fact that we've been through this pandemic, we know that kids have fallen short. Do you think that need is going to increase next year? Are parents going to demand more kids get tested? Are kids going to qualify for IEPs and special instructions that previously may not have? Because, that there's a group of people there's the IEP group, there is a group in the middle, and then there's this other, the accelerated kids. This group in the middle has a lower end group. Do you think some of them then will fall in the future to the IEP needs, thus increasing our cost?
We are testing. We're testing at an unprecedented rate right now, due to parent requests, building requests, based on their data review. And it's almost unfair norms, John, you would appreciate this, to compare it to. So our norms are based on kids who have been in school continuously. When we look at that discrepancy between IQ and academic achievement, both of those are based on kids being in school all the time, non-pandemic. And so, yes, kids are qualifying and kids are being tested at a very high rate. So to answer your question, are my costs going to go up? Yes. So remember that $300,000 that I didn't spend this year may come in handy next year.
Janet, do they ever go down?
We have had a continuous increase in the amount of students that are qualifying for special education supports and services.
That's what I thought.
Is that trend despite the fact that there's less kids in the building?
We've since 2016, we've increased 300 students receiving services.
That number's going up when
Yes.
our enrollment's going down.
Correct.
So
And if I may, sir,
Yep.
if I may, last Thursday morning, I met with our guidance counselors. If you recall, in the fall, you really enjoyed the conversation of listening to the counselors and their feedback on what they're receiving. I've asked them to have a representative at each building level, elementary, middle, and high, to share with you again what they're seeing right now. So it's projected to be for you next week to hear what they're hearing. What they've told me is that we have just seen the beginning of the tip of the iceberg on mental health issues. There's not enough agencies, and Janet can tell you this. I've talked to superintendents across the state, and the IU's working on their game plan to help us out. But there's not enough services out there to send students to. Not enough beds in for inpatient care out there. So that's what's coming our way, and it's not going to be forever, but it's going to be the tsunami that after the earthquake.
So to that end, Zach, does the budget that you present have that increase in the psychiatrist, or sorry, psychologist position?
So anything that would fall into that world is part of Janet's budget. So I believe she's accounted for some of that in the year.
Because we talked
first
about
year.
adding that position, right?
We already approved that, didn't we?
Yeah, I thought
I
so.
thought we did, but I want to make sure it's baked into the budget.
Oh, yeah. So we showed a reduction of FTEs, but it was net of positions we were talking about adding back in. I'd have to go back to see which ones were.
Okay,
It was 3 positions and psychologist is one of.
right. So to that end, I just challenge the board to think about that as we think about whether all-day kindergarten is the right answer. As you're balancing, because again, that spend's going to continue to climb as well, as you heard from the experts, which makes total sense. That we have a scenario where kids are falling short and they're going to be in that. So we're going to have increased costs there as well. And our projections, does the budget build in those projected increases, Zach?
So Lynn and I have a whole spreadsheet that has the assumptions built in for the outward years. Typically, we use where we don't have hard data, like a 2 to 3% increase per year. So like something like some of Janet's line items for the outward years, we would be assuming an average of 3% increase per year in some of those. Outside of that, I don't have anything more.
Janet, are you comfortable with that number, 3%?
I increased the budget where I felt like we needed support, and in talking with the ESSER funds, I'm pretty confident we'll be okay.
Just to be clear, we're talking 2 different things because Janet builds her individual year budget. We have no idea how many students would be. Then Lynn and I throw an assumption on for the outward years. So.
And getting back to something that Chris brought up earlier on about using the ESSER money to pay for a potential renovation, part of the renovation for QE, is that we have next week, in the board meeting and in the superintendent's report, we have a short little snapshot for you of how we recommend to spend the money if we get the full vote from the state.
And Keith,
You want to give us a little snapshot of that right now?
Zach,
well,
you
Keith,
have that sheet?
I wanted to mention something too, just back to like what Zach and Janet were just talking about. So like, say the teacher's contract now only goes out 3 years. So what they're going to do is assume like an extra 3% for those other 2 years that aren't contracted. Correct, Zach? Is that what you kind of meant?
Sorry,
there?
I was pulling up the sheet, Dr. Hunter. I didn't hear your question.
Oh, when you were talking about how you have to assume some contracted costs or some fees are going to increase, beyond the scope of what you can see. I use the example of like the teacher's contract is 3 years, and you're given 5-year projections. So when you're going out those extra 2, you're just adding in that 3%.
So what I typically would do is 3%, right around the Act 1. What I did for this one is I used 2% because I lowered it by 1%, which equates to about 2 FTEs, a reduction of 2 FTEs per year. That's how I accounted for that. I talked about it based on declining enrollment at reduction of 2 FTEs. I just reduced the percent increase in the outward years from what I normally would. Because obviously I don't know who the people would be retiring or what positions or anything like that. So I think this is the spreadsheet you were referring to, Dr. Hunter.
Yes. Yes.
This is the planning document that we started with cabinet and extended it out to our comprehensive plan leaders as well to tell us what they're thinking. And where where the focus obviously is learning loss, and until we have specific ways to address it, we just allocated about 1.5 million to additional learning loss needs.
I'm
What
curious, and this is just
any answers Keith's question to Janet about do you have enough? If we can use this money, one-term money over a 3-year period to help us with that tsunami that's about to hit, that's how we have that program. So then if the board wants to come back and make some different changes, then we may need operating dollars.
Yeah, so some of these things make me a little bit nervous, though, that they're used for these, Senator Mensch sent us all this letter that said, don't use this money for reoccurring things. Chromebooks are reoccurring costs. That they're going to be put into a schedule. I would assume we're going to stay one-to-one with devices moving forward now. That's kind of what I was thinking. Something like a Zoom license, yeah, we should probably be able to get rid of that, I would hope.
Yeah, the smaller things maybe, but most of this would not be reoccurring. And the idea around the learning loss and some of the other things in here, you would phase them in and phase them out. So we would either pay our own teachers, an hourly rate to do something outside of the school day or whatever it might be, which is something that you can easily phase in and easily phase out, or contracted services you can easily phase in and phase out. So,
But
Do you
I'm
anticipate?
saying the virtual model of 1.5 million.
so we just threw that in there. Again, we don't know how many students would want it.
But
Lisa,
there will be a savings associated with those students coming back as well. This should be a net gain if we get virtual students back from charters then.
Yes, sir.
And that was my question. Is there a way that you anticipate being able to reallocate some of these funds? So, if we put 1.5 towards the virtual model and we don't end up needing it, can we move that to?
Absolutely. These things are not set in stone. We have a lot of flexibility with the state application. What we have to do to at least ensure we're getting our money is submit an initial application on generally what we're going to do. Then Janelle Hilton, who is our grants writer, works with me, Lynn, Cabinet, and we constantly update things as we have updates. I think, Lisa, I want to say that 1.5 million is roughly 300 students is what that
Right.
equates to.
And it was just based on a basic calculation of some percentage of our students staying virtual, and then also what percentage of students we could return back. That's why I put here, that's the number, but it would hopefully be offset by then a reduction in the cyber charter, depending on how many of those 300 students were coming back to us.
And this does say at least 20% needs to be used for learning loss,
Correct.
not necessarily 100%.
Correct.
Do they define the areas of learning loss that you can use it for? Or can you just?
I'm not aware of any
designate
specific definitions. I think that's something Lisa, Janet, and the Nancy Ann and the team and principals would have to have those conversations. And again, we don't have all the rules, so I don't know if there's going to be some kind of report that we have to provide or justification. I'm not sure yet. Those are things that we're still waiting to hear on. The application for the ESSERS 3 has not appeared yet in the state e-grant system, so we don't know.
So the solicitor last night at the tech school had said at least what their initial look at the spending restrictions on these said that the federal government his guidance so far is they've been pretty lax about how strict they're going to give you a lot of leeway in how to spend this. But yes, if they put a number in there, 20% needs to be learning loss. That means, yes, you can't spend 100% on, building upgrades, say, or, you can't spend 100% on buying sanitizer for COVID related issues or
Correct.
things like that. Yeah.
Can I just put a pause in here and there's other board members on. I just like to see if they have any questions for the group. John, I know Kaylin's on. David, you were pretty quiet.
Just looking at the numbers of the funding that we're going to be receiving on this slide right here, I was just wondering, I don't know all the acronyms. So I know that Quakertown was expected to receive like a $3.5 million funding. And I just want to make sure, is that included in this? And if so, can you just share with me where that is? Oh, okay,
Yep,
ESSER.
right. Yeah, and so those are
What does
just
that stand for, by the way?
I don't know off the top of my head. I could look it up.
All these
It's
fun
the free
acronyms.
government printing press.
I just call
print more
it
money.
federal funding.
It came from those what are they? The big
The stimulus
stimulus.
packages.
Yeah, they were part of the stimulus packages.
So one thing I guess that I would just be thinking about when it comes to this funding we're assuming that we're not going to be receiving this additional funding. It sounds like we're going to have a lot more cost drivers than previous years in terms of mental health, possibly special education. So one thing that is an unknown is, are we going to continue to receive additional funding from the federal government? I think that school districts around the country are going to be faced with similar challenges, and they're going to be faced with cost drivers that are going to be outside of the norm. So I think an unknown, but maybe something that's hopeful for us, is that we'll continue, as we see some of these costs continue to increase in the upcoming years due to the backlash, I guess, from COVID, that we may be seeing more revenue, or not revenue, sorry, more funding than we expect.
Good
If I
point.
may, Pam, one of the things that Chris learned on his statewide PSBA meeting yesterday was that the state is looking at skimming off the top of our money, our public school money, and requiring us to give to the private schools that are in our area, that are in our jurisdiction. So we should have a plan, but not spend anything even after they give us our allocation, until we really get firm guidance from PDE and other state agencies on how to spend it.
Just remember
Sure,
my
that
burrito the
makes
size of your head story.
Yeah, I mean,
Don't
it
spend
makes
for
I'll
sense,
free.
never
but
forget it now.
I mean, think about us. We're a school district that we've had the privilege of being able to get our kids back, and we have a pretty healthy fund balance. But we're still going to be looking at some potential cost drivers in the future years. So we're not going to be alone in that. There are going to be Pennsylvania districts who are going to be suffering, and possibly a whole lot more than what we are. And I just can't, for the life of me, believe that the federal government and the state government, and although we won't be able to, we should plan for the worst. But I think that, you're looking at this additional funding this year of 3.5 million. And I think that there could be potential for us to see some additional monies that we don't. So again, not planning on it, just food for thought.
We did allocate in next year's budget 670,000 of ESSER 2. And that was something that was brought up at a prior finance meeting, because we know we have comp ed costs. We were pretty sure we're gonna have food service losses, and we did allocate some money depending on what the strategy is next year for our PPE cleaning and all those types of things for health and safety. So that's why you see the net 4.5 million here.
Another
That
quick
group-
note, in case anybody hasn't seen this, the USDA announced that they're going to also be offering free meals next year.
Correct.
So
It just
that
got
is
extended. Yeah.
it just got extended.
Yeah, it doesn't have any impact on our budget though, because that's this year and that was last year as well, because people still have to take the meals for us to get the subsidy return. Our costs are still there for all students. So it's only,
Right.
it's not a benefit to the school district. So that's why we try to work with our principals and Gary to continuously get that word out. Take the meal.
I believe next year, if we have hot meals in cafeterias, the kids will be a lot more likely to take them.
Yeah, and if they're free, I mean, look, it's not a huge, it's not going to help us either way. I mean, the biggest thing was this year we had losses of, what was it, 300,000?
500,000 we're expecting this year.
Holy moly. So that's a lot of money. So, but it sounds like you didn't necessarily include that either way for this budget year. So
None of
may
those
not
things
have
were
a big-
included in this year, no.
Yeah.
I'll stop packing my kids' lunches.
Zach, do we have any timeline on when we can expect the Easter money to come in?
So the Easter 2 application, I'd have to double check with Janelle. I think she started to submit things for that. ESSER 3, I don't know.
Well, we can anticipate it being here, say, before the new year.
I certainly would hope so, because you have to spend the money in the next 2 school years. So if they delay too long, you can't submit your application
Right.
before budgets are closed for next year. Now you can open your budget for these things, but I know school districts are pressing for it to be done before the budgets are closed.
There has even been rumors of another relief package.
So, John, you're a finance committee guy.
Yeah, appreciate the work put into this. And it, it's for folks who may or may not have seen these kinds of numbers before and the sort of trends, and thanks for calling out. John Kern will like this. Yeah, the pie chart says a lot. Not to mention the timeline. And one of the challenges from a perspective almost like, I don't want to say marketing, but PR maybe, the giving the administration the high bar to say, we're going to keep all our options open, keep it at a, the next vote can say, keep it at a high rate, but then knock it down in June when we're more comfortable with knowing no surprises are lurking in the grass. It's that sort of the kabuki dance of the way that we have to do state budgeting, and you can never go back, right? You can't do something lower now and then raise the budget later. So we always, those are just for those of you who haven't seen that often, or some of you in the audience, those are unfortunate realities we have to deal with. And the other reality is of the tiny, the reason this was my favorite graph is because it reminds us that there's only this tiny sliver that you actually get to wiggle and play with. So it's really challenging because there's so many costs that are just almost foisted upon us in some sense. So yeah, I appreciate everything did and looks great. And I think it was a good opportunity to expose a lot of the details behind what we face. So thanks.
David.
I appreciate you checking in. I don't have any questions right now, but if I did, I'm sure I would have interrupted someone. Thanks.
All right, so I think the game plan is we got one more finance meeting. It's May something, 5th or 6th.
We got to reschedule. We can come up with a date now if you want for the finance and facilities.
I could do the 5th. I could do the 5th.
Are you okay with that, Zach?
Yeah, we'll just, I'll talk to Terry St. Angelo and we can re-advertise.
And if everybody makes it, Chris said that he'd take us out for Cinco de Mayo, so we appreciate that, Chris. Thank you
I
very
forgot
much.
it's Cinco de Mayo, but.
So, and he says he's gonna have everybody at his house or something like that. I forgot what he said, but.
That can be future Keith's problem.
Burrito. Any other pressing questions? I do appreciate everybody's time. It's just 2 hours of your life. I know it's a lot. I thought it was very important as we go into, debating our increases that we're going to do. And more importantly, the direction we're going to give the administration with regards to whether it's QE renovations, whether it's all day kindergarten, whether it's alternating start times, whether it's the baseball field. And if I had unlimited funds, I would just ultimately approve everything. But I think we just have to be prudent and smart. And let's focus our attention on what's going to make the most impact on our kids and their outcomes. I do worry about the future, especially with the population that has fallen behind and getting those back up to speed. I know our teachers can do it. I know that Janet and Dr. Hoffman have a great plan to bring these kids along, but it's going to take work and effort and ultimately money. So let's make sure we're spending where it's going to really count.
Dr. Harner, we have a track at the high school, don't we?
Yes, sir.
Ah, thank you.
We were talking about the
Ron and
gravel.
Dave?
Talking about the Strayer thing, or?
Kind of just like I was internalizing that from earlier, and I'm like, I think we have a track somewhere, and then I couldn't remember where it was. Then I remembered it was inside.
I do agree with whoever wrote the letter that the Strayer track is awful.
I had
and
a
running on gravel is
response.
awful.
I had a response from Dr. Bubser on that, and I asked her and Holly. Most of you know Holly. She does everything at middle school for Dr. Bubser, and she runs the athletic program and included. And we've been, or Dr. B has been around to a lot of the middle school tracks, and ours is one of the better ones. It is on Rob's list way down as a priority to put a surface on it versus gravel, but it's adequate, adequate for that. But and Caitlin asked me to answer the parent.
Yeah.
Are they allowed to like practice inside and use the high school track, or, like we're not forcing them to use that?
Back when I was in high school, Doc Stevens had me running on a gravel track around the alumni field. I survived.
I still have gravel in my knee. from
I
where
might still
was
have
down.
some in my knees, but
Well, we noticed
I
you
will
don't run
say-
anymore, Chris.
only when chased.
You were a sprinter though. You were on a
Hurdles.
That was
Hurdle.
an epic burn. I'm just saying.
All right. So any other questions? Anything for the good of the order? Everybody have a great night. Thanks again.
You too.
Lynn and Zach, thank you. Dr. Harner, thank
Yes.
you. Janet,
Good night, everyone.
Dr.
Wash your
Hoffman,
hands.
Everybody else.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks.